Bienvenidos al Interamerican Institute for Democracy este jueves 30 de julio del 2026. El Interamerican Institute for Democracy tiene una serie de actividades como son exposiciones, foros, conferencias, y en esta ocasión tenemos una sesión de honor de un director importante del Interamerican Institute for Democracy. Es la sesión de honor de incorporación del Dr. Robert Evan Ellis como miembro del Directorio del Interamerican Institute. El Interamerican Institute for Democracy es una entidad privada sin fines de lucro, cuyo objetivo es la promoción, la difusión de los valores de la libertad, la democracia, los derechos humanos y la institucionalidad en las Américas. Está constituido por académicos, políticos, profesionales, trabajadores, empresarios, hombres y mujeres de distintas nacionalidades. Para empezar este evento, invito al Dr. Rodolfo Milani, director del Interamerican Institute for Democracy, a realizar la presentación del evento. Bienvenido.
Good morning. It is with great pleasure that I welcome my good friend, Dr. Robert Evan Ellis, to our Board of Directors here at the Inter-American Institute for Democracy. His seminal work exposing the activities of rogue regimes in our hemisphere, being an effective U.S. policy in response. Dr. Ellis is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. His regional focus is on the relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism. Dr. Ellis has published over 400 works, including 5 books. The 2009 book, China in Latin America, The Whats and Wherefores. The 2013 book, The Strategic Dimension of Chinese Engagement with Latin America. The 2014 book, China on the Ground in Latin America. The 2018 book, Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the 2022 book, China Engages Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy. He has given testimony on Latin America security issues to the U.S. Congress on various occasions. He has discussed his work regarding China and other external actors in Latin America on a broad range of radio and television programs and is cited regularly in the print media in both the U.S. and Latin America. Dr. Ellis has also been awarded the Order of Military Merit Jose Maria Cordova by the Colombian government for his scholarship on security issues in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert Evan Ellis.
Buen día a todos y todas. Para mí realmente es un gran honor de estar acá con ustedes, de ser incorporado como miembro del directriz de este instituto, por lo que significa la organización, por lo que representa, pero también por conocer un poco de la valentía y estas habilidades de todos ustedes acá, quien ha abogado, quien ha luchado para la democracia en varias maneras en la región y para estar parte de todo esto. También quiero agradecer especialmente a mi amigo Rodolfo Milani y mi amigo y mentor Carlos Sánchez Berzaín por también la oportunidad de hacer esto y el directriz, el liderazgo de esta institución. También quiero dar un agradecimiento especial por su esfuerzo en ayudarme a publicar mi nuevo libro, Chinese Engagement in Latin America, New Patterns and Challenges, lo que dentro de poco va a estar disponible en Amazon y en otros lugares por la organización. Este evento de hoy día, y me han dado como 40 minutos para conversar sobre temas de democracia, algo ya peligro de dar a este gringo parlanchín una oportunidad así, pero mi inspira de reflexionar un poco en lo que significa democracia y este entorno cambiante que impacta América Latina y también el mundo más amplio, especialmente los Estados Unidos. Quiero destacar que los perspectivos expresados acá son míos propios y no representan ninguna otra institución. Ya en el interés de claridad y precisión, el resto de mis comentarios, voy a leer mis comentarios y también voy a publicarlos, pero lo voy a leer con permiso en inglés. So, switching to English, I'll begin this with a that is that this isn't a feel-good speech about democracy. It's a series of reflections that I feel compelled to share with some trepidation, and for which this occasion gives me an ideal opportunity. For me, there's a convergence of forces that's currently transforming the global environment, and together these forces pose grave risks for our democracy, our prosperity, and our security. Those risks are greater than any time that I have seen in my own professional career beginning in the 1990s. They're also reinforced, I fear, by a reluctance for us to openly talk about some of them, as well as some associated political dynamics that I fear prevent us in this country from effectively addressing some of those dangers as a society. In the context of the coming storm, never before has it been so important for us to express with clarity the values of our ideals about democracy, individual liberty, and limited government, especially within a framework of rule of law. Never before has it been so important to also embrace and fight for the conditions that enable democracy to prevail, including a culture that values respect for democratic rules, education, and tolerance. And in addition, to wage that struggle for democracy with a spirit of decency. I grew up in the Cold War. It was a time that Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. It was never a real moment of the end of history, but it was a moment when it was possible to believe in the inevitable triumph of democracy over totalitarianism. Today, democracy, I fear, and the faith and values that underpin it are under grave stress. That arriving storm can be felt in the polarization of our societies and the willingness in too many places to accept the bending of rules to achieve results. In a disturbing poll by Latino Barometro, half of those surveyed in Latin America said that they would support a leader who could deliver results, even if it were necessary to adopt non-democratic solutions to get those results. The peoples of Latin America, as elsewhere, have long been disillusioned with the inadequate performance of their governments, particularly with respect to the material needs and insecurities in their societies. We've seen that recent elections in Ecuador and in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru were all dominated by these issues, especially in security. The corruption endemic to our region, fueled partly but not completely by drugs and other transnational criminal flows, undermines hope for people that democratic institutions can make things better. Beyond these commonly cited stresses, it's important to highlight the multiple detrimental impacts of technology on democratic health. Despite its benefits, as well as highlighting the adversarial role played by the People's Republic of China in this struggle. The hyperconnectivity of the internet and today's social media has all expanded the interchange of perceptions and discourse among people, but it has also done so through self-selected groups of interest, which are also groups of bias, as well as through the algorithms that feed users on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Artificial intelligence has greatly expanded content and facilitated information gathering, but it's also fed public cynicism because it's made the fabrication or distortion of content easy and even routine. If technology has done more to erode than to promote the community discourse that is so vital for our democracy, its application in practice has arguably also empowered state control. Where cameras with facial recognition linked to citizen financial and other data, internet controls, and public transportation have made reality of what the philosopher Jeremy Bentham once called the panopticon. Such technology has enabled levels of state control over society that the government of the former Soviet Union only aspired to. Even beyond totalitarian pioneers such as the PRC, the combination of connectivity, big data, observation techniques, and the simultaneous monitoring of hundreds of millions of people at a time, made possible by artificial intelligence, together gives the state unprecedented knowledge over our activities, including the ability to identify the behavior of individuals that the state approves or disapproves of. It also gives the state the ability to reward and punish those people through the state's control over their access to the digital world, which is, of course, these days fundamental to our communication, our transportation, our medical care, buying food, and virtually every. The sharing of technologies by PRC-based companies with their authoritarian allies, such as Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, has all extended the life of authoritarian regimes in those cases. Use of Chinese-supplied telecommunications architectures to cut off protesters from each other during those July 2021 uprisings, and then allowing the Cuban government to repress its way out of that crisis. In addition to the effects of technology, it's also important to talk about the adverse impacts of the PRC itself on democracy and the attitudes towards democracy. The perceived examples of the PRC, complemented by the messiness of our contemporary democracies, is shaping the discourse in Latin America and elsewhere on the appropriate role of the state in the economy and the limits that should be placed on the state. I grew up, again, during the Cold War, and my thinking about the role of the state in society was shaped by authors such as George Orwell, Ayn Rand, and Milton Friedman. Such authors articulated in those days with clarity the inherently malevolent effects of empowering the state at the expense of the individual. Although U.S. democracy had difficulties even in that era, the contrast back then between American society with our cultural vibrancy and economic and technological achievements versus the soul-crushing gray oppression of the Soviet Union or Mao's China or Cuba were self-evident. Today, however, for many in the so-called TikTok generation that did not grow up with that experience, communist China, shown through the lens of YouTube influencers, is a world of shiny skyscrapers, fast, clean trains, and digital payment systems. Sadly, that vision transmitted in YouTube often contrasts unfavorably for many in Latin America and elsewhere with aging graffiti-covered infrastructure of the Big Apple, New York, and Detroit, and a U.S. political system that appears polarized and dysfunctional, making more threats than offering benefits. Reflecting such perceptions, a recently released survey by AMLAT Radar shows that for the first time, Latin Americans see China, not the U.S., as the best model for development. 36% in that survey chose the PRC, an increase of 7 percentage points over the prior 2022 survey. Meanwhile, those selecting the U.S. fell 13 percentage points. The U.S. actually finished in third place, behind Japan as well. In the context of these stresses, it's important to emphasize that a healthy democracy is not just about voting. It requires several interdependent attributes. Number one, the protection and empowerment of the individual, including freedom of economic choices and also their consequences. Number two, the limitation of government. And number three, the rule of law. But beyond these fundamentals, for me, the survival of democracy is facilitated by a culture committed to certain enabling ideals. For me, these include, first, support for democracy itself and adherence to the rules required to sustain it. Number two, support for the accumulation of accurate information and knowledge. And number three, mutual respect among the diverse members of the polity. For me, protecting and empowering the individual is the necessary cornerstone of democracy. Without reasonable protection from state and other coercion, and without security in the economic base created by the individual's efforts, sincere democracy and expression is just not possible. The history of authoritarianism from the Soviet Union to Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua is all replete with regimes who not only deprived individuals of their physical ability to vote or communicate or their physical liberty, but also making the costs of expressing their true political feelings too great to risk or frankly just economically impossible. Because democracy is about more than just votes and the physical ability to communicate, a healthy democracy requires the limitation of government. That includes meaningful checks and balances and the rule of law. The history of the hijacking of democracies, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, involves populists who bent the rules, and then legislatures and judiciaries who were intimidated by the so-called mandate of the newly elected leaders and hesitated to fully enforce the laws when they were being bent. That combination allowed those populists to install their own cronies in the judiciary, the prosecutors' offices, and other key posts. Those populists then consolidated their power little by little by altering or imposing laws and weaponizing the judicial system, including selectively investigating and prosecuting opponents, firing those of questionable loyalty in the bureaucracy, and defunding or eliminating organizations that dared to oppose them. Countries such as Venezuela, where there is a dominant extractive sector, or others where there is not a private sector independent of government leverage, are particularly vulnerable to such hijacking. There, once the government controls the primary ways for making a living, it becomes hard to dissent while still feeding your family. Finally, democracy requires not just principles, but a culture that nurtures its defense. Now, my own beliefs on this are shaped by my graduate work on the rise of fascism many years ago, and understanding what made the Holocaust possible. Ironically, they were also shaped years later by my work on the hijacking of democracy in Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, home of, as I indicated before, many of my mentors and friends who, over the years, also became exiles. In each of these cases, and you would say, how are these common? But in each of these cases and others, the hijacking of democracy is enabled by disillusioned populations who have lost faith in playing by the rules to get results. In this situation, the rancheros surrounding Caracas are not so different from my neighbors in now opioid and fentanyl-blighted Ohio, where I grew up. That sense of frustration and losing faith in the system. The problem is that when the populists bend the rules to get results and the establishment complains, it is in the end the failure of enough disillusioned people to get upset enough that becomes decisive. The populists are allowed to change the rules, then they install their cronies in key positions, consolidate power, and then little by little, the price of standing up against them becomes ever greater, and by the time enough people get upset enough, it's too late. It's also important to highlight the role of resentment and intolerance in that downward spiral. For me, the populist modus operandi is always to convince their followers that some other is to blame for their suffering. They fabricate facts to bolster that narrative and to argue that their policies are working. By the time that enough loyal followers feel that things have gone too far, it's too late. Now, through history, those that the populists blame vary according to era and by their ideology. In some eras, the Jews, corrupt elites, Yankee imperialists, Muslims, immigrants, or the woke. As populations become more polarized and confused in the spiral, information and respect are the critical inoculating elements to inoculate societies against the fabrication of grievances and the dissemination of fictions that allow populists to hijack democracies. In the context of these thoughts about democracy and populism, I now want to turn to another very grave subject, which is the troubling dynamics that are transforming our current global environment. I want to focus on 6 interacting forces. This is where we go from the positive to the less positive. Number 1, accelerated deterioration of the rules-based international order. 2, technology as an enabler of small state blackmail. 3, economic transformation and job displacement. 4, technology-driven military revolution. 5, the geopolitical transition to a dominant PRC. And 6, one or more major geopolitical shocks. To begin with, the world order. For me, the deteriorating rules-based international order, however imperfect, was the key to the advance of global commerce and progress since the Second World War. That order is now unraveling at an accelerating rate. As I've written previously, during the past 2 decades, this unraveling has been driven by unplanned but increasingly important synergies between an increasingly powerful PRC pursuing its own interests and a disparate group of what I call illiberal states, from Iran to Venezuela to North Korea. For these, commercial and other engagement with the PRC provides them alternatives to the rules and constraints of the dominant Western system. Reciprocally, working with illiberal regimes advances PRC commercial, technological, and other strategic objectives. It also helps those regimes, like Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, to survive in ways that distract and undermine China's rivals, such as the United States. The deterioration of the rules-based order, sadly, is accelerating. A key driver, frankly, is the current U.S. move away from underwriting the institutions of that order, even if many of the criticisms of those institutions are completely valid. Similarly, I fear that U.S. defense of our actions in terms of our interests instead of shared norms and rules, which may be candid, but it's also accelerating the deterioration of those always shaky norms and rules in the international system. Number 2, technology as an enabler of small state blackmail. For me, technology, even while boosting the power of the state over its own population, as we've talked about, has also given smaller states and non-state actors unprecedented ability to disrupt and blackmail beyond their borders. Robert Pape, writing in Foreign Affairs, documents how technology such as drones now gives smaller actors such as Iran or even Taiwan the power to hold international shipping channels at risk or enable other forms of blackmail. Those same dynamics can be seen also with the Houthis in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, with Ukraine's fight against Russia, and even with criminal organizations operating in Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere. The expanded technology-enabled operations for small states and other non-state actors to blackmail, though, goes far beyond Iran and drones. Criminal groups and others now also can threaten companies and even states through cyber warfare. My colleagues from Costa Rica, of course, remembered how that occurred with the Conti ransomware not that long ago. Frankly, the proliferation of Chinese open-source artificial intelligence models, such as Kimi and DeepSeek, with the capability to rapidly exploit vulnerabilities in commercial and government architectures, even disabling physical systems, will give more options to small states and criminal extortionists worldwide. At the same time, cryptocurrencies, ever more used, coupled with weakening cooperation in an international financial system, will make it ever harder to fund and punish such extortionists, or find and punish such extortionists and other bad actors. 3, technology-based economic transformation and job displacement. Right now, as we've probably felt, there are mutually reinforcing revolutions in connectivity-enabled big data, artificial intelligence, and robotics forming the global economy. This can be a good thing, but it has enormous political and societal consequences. The expanding capability of AI-empowered robots by companies such as Tesla, Unity. Like the personal computers of the 1990s, I see that the reinforcing advances of hardware and software in these robots in the next decade will little by little change everything. If you do the math of a factory robot, which can do legitimate factory work, financed over its 5-year life, is already less than the salary of a human factory worker in most advanced countries. Those robots now walk themselves to the recharging station and generally don't get sick, complain, or unionize. Before concluding the sky is falling, that the global economy will certainly, I believe, create new types of jobs. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella suggests that these types of jobs will probably involve human beings doing more to delegate and supervise robots and non-physical AI. However, to be realistic and clear, such advances will not fully compensate for the scope and rapidity of the jobs that are rendered obsolete. As AI and robotics become cheaper than human labor in areas from programming to legal and technical tasks, to assembly lines, to housework, it will likely cause jobs for humans in such categories to disappear far faster than the market and governments can generate new positions. Training and relocating those displaced humans is yet another problem altogether. That mass displacement is going to create political shocks and fundamental questions about the adequacy of market-based economic systems to accommodate human suffering or of such tectonic shifts. That tension is going to drive even more populist and authoritarian alternatives to democracies already under stress for not meeting expectations. Ironically, Latin America may suffer displacement more gradually than more developed economies. Ironically, since its labor costs are relatively lower, and in Latin America, robots will and are beginning to displace agriculture and mining workers in order to allow the more efficient exploitation of the technology-driven military revolution. As a complement to the economic impacts, if I haven't already depressed you enough, a military revolution enabled by the synergies between big data, AI, and robotics will be both transformational and deadly. Ironically, the wars unleashed by the economic and social displacement that I just described will likely be the demonstration ground for these new military capabilities and their lethality. Now, much of my first 14 years in my professional career focused on something called the revolution in military affairs. I remember in the 1990s, we used to wargame how the convergence of new technologies, operational and organizational concepts would transform the nature of warfare, thinking of the then distant world of 2025. Now, came to pass, the military reality on the next horizon is just as possible and just as disturbing. In addition to the swarms of autonomous systems that we are already seeing in the air, on the ground, and make lethal actions and decisions faster than humans can monitor them. Meanwhile, information warfare on the other side, on all sides, will seek to corrupt or spoof those platforms and those management lethal effects happening faster than humans can understand on the battlefield, and all sides will be actively trying to screw up the logic of their opponent's system. In other words, a lot of really bad things are going to happen on that battlefield. Really smart people right now in the Pentagon and elsewhere trying to think through both the technical and big picture questions. But in the end, a lot will come down to the real conflicts that expose unforeseen interactions at great costs of human lives, treasure, and governments. In the wake of those deadly surprises, the victors, the vanquished, and the rest of the world will all scramble to exploit or cover up the vulnerabilities that are exposed in the course of those lethal battles. Factor 5, geopolitical transition to a dominant China. It's highly likely, although in the coming 2 decades, the PRC will overtake the U.S. through some combination of its advances in economic, technological, and military capabilities and strategic influence. It is possible, but not certain, that PRC-based firms will come to dominate AI through the widespread adaptation of their open source models, especially the open source ones, commercially deploying them at scale in markets like Latin America, Africa, and developing Asia, even if Western technology is better. We've already seen something similar to this occurred with Chinese companies in renewable energy, telecommunications, and other sectors. Complementing and reinforcing the possibility, PRC advances in quantum computers will also be revolutionary. These could provide a leap in computational speed. Through that, especially in areas like decryption, it could give the Chinese Communist Party unparalleled access to the secrets of Western firms and governments. Beyond AI and quantum computing, PRC UB tech, like I referred to before, may also come to dominate global robotics. As in AI, this would likely involve deploying government-subsidized, initially mediocre products at scale, as is occurring now, but then bringing down costs market. Indeed, the recent U.S. ban on PRC-built robots in the U.S., I think, illustrates that this is already becoming a concern for the United States. As I just suggested, in regions is likely to be an arena of strategic competition. That's because PRC-based companies blocked from access to the US and European markets will likely focus on the developing world in order to build volume as locking in advantages in sectors like AI, quantum computing, and in robotics. It will also continue to leverage its enormous scale advantages in manufacturing. We've seen this in military shipbuilding. Also, the PRC will slowly overcome the US qualitative advantages as well as just the quantitative. Yet, shipbuilding is yesterday's example. I worry in order to produce, frankly, millions of humanoid soldiers, quadruped combat systems, and other future autonomous aerial, maritime, and ground systems more cheaply and better than U.S. defense contractors. If my analysis seems grim, it's important to emphasize that many that I have followed in the PRC believe that they are on a path to surpass the United States, even while recognizing the many things that can go wrong. The PRC is very conscious of the opportunities and risks of managing the global power transition that it sees itself currently in with the United States. As such, it's proceeding with caution, albeit also with confidence. These attitudes of cautious confidence are already fueling PRC assertiveness around the globe, particularly where it feels its military and economic position is dominant. That's particularly true in the Pacific, where its maritime claims and militarization of reefs and shoals in the South China Sea are already showing its aggression. In the Western Hemisphere, in the not-too-distant future, I worry that such increasing PRC confidence could change China's current posture of deference to the U.S. and deference to the sovereign decisions of its Latin American partners. Current PRC coercion against the Panamanian state over its sovereign decision of its courts to remove Hong Kong-based Hutchison from 2 ports may highlight where things are going with that PRC confidence and disrespect for Latin American sovereignty. It's not hard to imagine in the future a confident PRC, not many years from now, seeking military bases and formal military cooperation, next generation of anti-U.S. populist regimes. Beyond Latin America, that same growing confidence of the PRC will likely also lead the China Communist Party to act decisively in celebration of the 100th anniversary of its takeover of the mainland. Now, whether or not such action spawns a major war or simply Western capitulation, the end of Taiwan's autonomy, in my judgment, would mark a before and after in the PRC transition to global dominance. 6, one or more major geopolitical shocks. For me, driven by or complicating these other disruptions we've discussed, it is more likely than not in the next decade or so that global dynamics will be transformed by one or more shocks. These could include a major war arising from PRC moves against Taiwan, as we discussed. Alternatively, it could come from the escalation of Russia's fight with Ukraine in Europe. It could arise from the current situation in the Middle East. Another opportunity for such shocks is a possible major nuclear exchange. This could involve any number of actors who currently have or may soon have nuclear weapons, including Russia, Iran, India, Pakistan, or even Israel. Nuclear deterrence is already weakened by complacency, by China's nuclear buildup, by Russia and U.S. abrogation of past nuclear treaties such as START, plus the expanding number of global actors in the nuclear range that gives uncertainty. Nuclear deterrence will be further eroded by the expanded tension and uncertainty of the coming world that I am sadly describing today. Other global shocks could include a major new pandemic, even more disruptive and devastating than COVID-19. I worry that the institutions and channels for medical collaboration in the international system have already been debilitated by distrust and defunding. The world may also face a significant escalation of cyber attacks, as I noted before, enabled by AI, impacting not only the global financial system, not only the infrastructure that sustains our life and economic activities, but also impacting the automation and robotics, which will be an increasingly important and vulnerable part of our daily lives and economies in the coming years. Western Hemisphere outlook. Turning to the Western Hemisphere, for me, the outlook is a reflection of the trends that I've already discussed today. So let's for a moment begin with the positive. There are currently an unprecedented number of governments in the region who are disposed to work with the United States, although each for their own reasons. That cooperation, however, I fear, is more fragile than it appears. The incentives for the Lula government in Brazil to moderate its embrace of the PRC or to the BRICS or various leftist causes could vanish, I fear, if Lula wins the election in October and becomes an 80-year-old last-term president with scores to settle. Similarly, the incentives of the leftist Morena government of Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico to currently cooperate on security, tax, and China issues could also dramatically change with the eventual end to USMCA, TICLAN, or if the U.S. government names the sitting Morena party as an entity supporting foreign terrorist organizations such as the Sinaloa or Jalisco Nueva Generación cartels. Frankly, last week during my conversations in Mexico City, this is exactly what some of my Mexican colleagues fear that President Trump might do. And that naming for Morena party would have devastating financial and other consequences for the party and for things tied to it. Beyond these two questionably friendly governments, the region's democracies are already, as we've seen, under enormous pressures. As I've noted, things will get worse due to the dynamics we've examined today, including the possible fracturing of the global economy, disruption of production, expanded criminality, increasing extortion options for state and non-state actors, plus the expanding relative power of the PRC vis-a-vis the United States, all impacting the decisions of Latin American governments and societies. Over time, I fear that if the current group of U.S. allied Latin American governments cannot show tangible benefits for their choices to partner with the U.S. and other associated choices, we could see a new swing to the left in the region within the decade. That will create risk of a new anti-U.S. populist governments opening doors to the PRC and other extra-hemispheric U.S. adversaries. In the future, I fear that new populist governments, as they defy the United States, will find a now more powerful and self-confident PRC who is willing to be bolder in its outreach this time around. It may be even willing to defend its populist partners economically and perhaps even militarily against future U.S. pressures in a way it's not willing to do today. Recommendations. There are no easy solutions to the challenges in Latin America and the rest of the world with its faces on democracy, security, prosperity, and other issues. I warned you this wouldn't be a happy speech. My purpose today is not to offer inspiration or reassurance, but to advance 4 principles that I believe can help us to navigate to some degree the coming challenges. Resilience, strengthening institutions and transparency, nurturing key international partnerships, and articulating the values of democratic principles and their enablers. Number 1, resilience. For me, it is vital for both the U.S. and other governments to build more. We can hope to avoid the shocks to come, but for me, we must prepare to endure them without economic collapse and without the breakdown of democratic governance, whatever other bad things happen. Such potential crises include the disintegration of global supply chains and economic contractions, technological fueled job losses, and transparency. For me, it's important that we strengthen our governance institutions at all levels, including those of our partners. That means ensuring greater transparency and technical capacity. Part of doing so should be prioritizing education, which is, for me, the cornerstone, as we've seen, of both economic adaptation and the defense against populism. Our strengthening of those institutions must not, however, stop at the national level and national borders. For me, it is vital that we invest in a new generation of multilateral institutions and partnerships. It is important that we rebuild intelligently and judiciously, ensuring that those institutions do not become lost in the pursuit of utopian visions and projects that are of unproven value, however noble that they may seem. Rather, it's important that those institutions are laser-focused on strength, including transactional criminality, and to fight the progressive erosion of the rules-based international order. 3, nurturing key international partnerships. As a complement to work that actors coordinate in the economic and technology realm, as well as in the political and military domains. For me, priorities should include respectful collaboration with Europe, particularly NATO. It should also include working constructively with and avoiding line of defense against the gathering darkness of PRC power in Asia. 4, and finally, articulate the value of democratic principles. For me, beyond these technical or institutional acts, state at the expense of the individual predictably and consequentially and consistently leads to oppression and misery. Liberty is eventually regained, but only at tremendous. Focusing on a core concept, it's this: decency. I greatly respect the courage, value, and leadership of those who are here as part of the Inter-American Institute of Democracy in this struggle for democracy. Requires respect from each of us toward the others regarding the choices that we make, so long as those choices do not impinge upon the others. Keeping democracy healthy, remembering that we are all, at least for now, human in these decisions. I'm truly honored by the incorporation into the Inter-American Institute of Democracy and its board of directors.
Invito a la sección de comentarios al Dr. Carlos Sánchez Berzaín, director ejecutivo del Interamerican Institute. Bienvenido.
La presencia de los miembros del directorio del Interamerican Institute for Democracy, nuestro presidente Tomás Regalado, nuestros directores aquí presentes, el embajador Armando Valladares, la doctora Beatriz Rangel, el doctor Marcel Feró, el doctor Ricardo Israel y el ingeniero Rodrigo Arboleda. Y agradezco a los miembros del directorio que están conectados por Zoom en esta sesión de honor. Presidente Osvaldo Hurtado, Norberto Espángaro desde la Argentina, Francisco Santos de Colombia, José Acel en Montana, doctor César Vidal desde Washington, D.C., Luis Felipe de Orleans y de Braganza del Brasil, Luis González Posada desde el Perú y Mariano Causino desde la India, donde es embajador. Gracias. Y gracias al nuevo miembro del directorio, el doctor Robert Ivan Ellis, por la exposición académica que acaba de presentar. Información global, no solamente para el hemisferio occidental, que nosotros llamamos las Américas, sino para cada uno de los países de la región, en los que el Instituto, el Interamerican Institute for Democracy, trabaja promoviendo, defendiendo, sosteniendo la libertad, la democracia, los derechos humanos y la institucionalidad. Robert Ivan Ellis nos ha empezado diciendo que este no es un discurso optimista sobre la democracia. Nos ha recordado que los ideales de la democracia son básicamente dos: la libertad individual y el gobierno limitado. Dice en su trabajo que hoy la democracia está bajo una grave presión: la polarización de nuestras sociedades y la disposición en demasiados lugares a aceptar el incumplimiento de las reglas para lograr los resultados. El resolver de la dictadura cubana, el de Meto Nomás de la dictadura en Bolivia. Robert plantea que hay múltiples impactos perjudiciales de la tecnología, y vivimos en un momento de revolución tecnológica, en la salud de la democracia, a lo que agrega el papel negativo de la China, de la dictadura china. Y dice, lo voy a citar textualmente, que la hiperconectividad de Internet y las redes sociales actuales han ampliado el intercambio de percepciones y discursos entre las personas, pero también lo han distorsionado y atomizado. Esto se ha producido y se produce a través de grupos de interés autoseleccionados y sesgos, así como mediante los algoritmos que alimentan a los usuarios en plataformas como TikTok e Instagram. Sigue diciendo en su el Instituto que la inteligencia artificial ha expandido enormemente el contenido y facilitado la recopilación de información, pero también ha alimentado el cinismo público al hacer que la fabricación o distorsión de contenido sea fácil e incluso rutinaria. Y después ofrece una conclusión que hay que estudiar. Dice, si bien la tecnología ha contribuido más a erosionar que a promover el diálogo comunitario vital para la democracia, su aplicación práctica también ha fortalecido el control estatal a expensas del individuo. Esto se evidencia claramente en la República Popular China, donde cámaras con reconocimiento facial, vinculadas a datos financieros y de otro tipo de los ciudadanos, controles de Internet y transporte público, han hecho realidad lo que el filósofo Jeremy Bentham denominó panóptico. Este es un análisis de extrema gravedad, pero que vivimos todos los días. Y después el doctor Ellis hace la aplicación de estos conceptos que nos presenta hoy día a la realidad de la región y de nuestros países. Y dice que el intercambio de estas tecnologías por parte de empresas chinas con sus aliados autoritarios como Cuba, Venezuela y Nicaragua han prolongado la existencia de esos regímenes. Agregando, un ejemplo es el uso que hizo Cuba de las infraestructuras de telecomunicaciones suministradas por China para aislar a los manifestantes en julio de 2021 y reprimir la crisis. En este trabajo importante, que lo vamos a publicar, traducir y difundir, porque son los temas de los que hay que hablar hoy día en plena revolución tecnológica, en una democracia amenazada, pero en un momento de optimismo, porque a partir del cambio de la política interna y la política exterior de los Estados Unidos, y a partir sobre todo del hecho histórico del 3 de enero de este año, donde se extrae al dictador Maduro de Venezuela, hay una corriente optimista donde las dictaduras de delincuencia organizada transnacional están siendo arrinconadas, donde se producen cambios que parecen no tan rápidos, no suficientes, pero el trabajo de Robert nos plantea el desafío de mirar más allá, de mirar la sombra de la dictadura más importante del mundo y más poderosa del mundo, que es la China, que sin duda lidera la amenaza contra las democracias del mundo. Y dice, dado que la democracia abarca más que votos y la capacidad física de comunicarse, una democracia sana, recomienda, requiere la limitación del poder gubernamental. Esto incluye controles y equilibrios efectivos en el Estado de Derecho. La historia del secuestro de las democracias, incluyendo Venezuela, Nicaragua y Bolivia, involucra a populistas que manipulan reglas y luego a legislaturas o poderes judiciales que, intimidados por el mandato del líder elegido, dudan en aplicar plenamente la ley. O sea, el destrozo del Estado de Derecho. Termino los comentarios sobre el trabajo del doctor Ellis con una previsión que él hace al final de su discurso y que quiero recordar para nuestro mundo hispano. Dice, el mundo venidero será uno en que los gobiernos en crisis se verán tentados a seguir el ejemplo y quizás a buscar el respaldo de una República Popular China cada vez más rica y poderosa y de soluciones autoritarias en general. Mientras los estados consideren adoptar el autoritarismo para evitar dificultades económicas, para evitar inseguridad y desorden político a corto plazo, debemos recordar constantemente las lecciones de la historia. Empoderar al Estado a expensas del individuo conduce de forma predecible y sistemática a la opresión y a la miseria. La libertad solo se recupera a un costo enorme. Y termina nuestro nuevo director diciendo que si le permitimos concluir concentrándose en un solo concepto, él recomienda la decencia. Sobre esto, además de felicitar a Robert, quiero decir que el Interamerican Institute for Democracy, gracias a su presencia, gracias a su capacidad, gracias a su trabajo y experiencia, abre hoy día y amplifica una etapa importante en lo que es la defensa de la libertad, la democracia, los derechos humanos y la institucionalidad en las Américas, con la creación de un comité sobre estudios chinos, para estudiar lo que son las amenazas, lo que son las influencias, lo que son los efectos de la dictadura más importante en la región y en determinados países. Robert ya ha planteado efectos. Vivimos los efectos de la influencia china en la región. Y los efectos no solamente se manifiestan sobre la democracia o la potencia más importante o el país más poderoso del mundo, que son Estados Unidos, sino se manifiestan en toda la región. Desde inversiones económicas, como el control que ahora está cesando de parte del Canal de Panamá, el importante puerto en el Perú, el control de tierras en la Argentina, la relación íntima con el gobierno paradictatorial de Lula en el Brasil, una presencia indeterminada de explotación y usurpación de riquezas en Bolivia con complicidad del sistema dictatorial, muy similar a la que pasa con el tema de la explotación ilegal de oro en Venezuela, en el Perú, en el Ecuador, y un larguísimo etcétera de la presencia china, que tiene mucho dinero, mucha tecnología y que es además muy atractiva en relación a la presencia de la democracia, porque la corrupción para la dictadura china es solamente un elemento más de su influencia, mientras que para la democracia es un elemento que deteriora esto que Robert Ellis ha presentado como recomendación final, que es la decencia. Bienvenido, Robert. Tengo mucho gusto de declarar la apertura de nuestro comité a cargo de nuestro nuevo director para estudiar esta gravísima situación de amenaza a la democracia que es la China.
Y Y dada la importancia del tema, también quiero resaltar el hecho de que quienes estén interesados en leer o profundizar en la propuesta del doctor Ellis está colocado tanto en inglés, en español y en portugués en la página web del Instituto, que es indemocratic.org. A continuación invito a realizar la admisión al presidente del Interamerican Institute for Democracy, don Tomás Regalado. Bienvenido, don Tomás.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días. Good morning. Thank you very much. I want to thank our executive director, Institute for Democracy in the Americas, the embodies the resilience. You have sitting here people that for decades have fought, suffered, but hope for freedom that Latin America is seeing. Hopefully, your participation will be part of the new American Institute is planting through our weekly and meetings, and also by publishing books. From Cuba, we have here important people that have been part of the history of Cuba for the last 7 decades. Venezuela, from Bolivia, from Colombia, from Chile, and all of them want the best for Latin America and the best for the United States. So it is my honor on behalf of our executive director, our board of directors, to induct you in as member of the board of directors of the Interamerican Institute for Democracy. Welcome, Doctor.